Hello and welcome to another episode of the State of Politics. As per usual, I'm your host, Declan McConville. My co-host is Patrick McGilp, and again, we've got a guest on this week. We have got journalist and political commentator Angela Haggerty. Angela, how are you doing?
I'm all right. We've also got wee Frank, my little boy Francis, with us this week as well, as you can probably hear. So just as a warning, you will hear toddler a lot through this episode.
I think you'll be our first double guest. So there you go. You've broke State of Politics, and you're the first double guest. So just to kick off, people know you from your writing and appearing on TV and stuff. How did you get into that? Where did your early interest begin?
I think I always had an interest in politics. I had that from I was really young. I was a bit of a weird kid at school talking about Iraq and things. So I think that interest was always there. But the interest in journalism was a bit of an accident. People used to tell me when I was like in my teens that I should become a journalist because I had that interest in politics in the world, and I didn't want to. It was I thought it would be like the last thing I wanted to do because I didn't have a lot of faith in the industry. I thought it was very cutthroat, and I didn't think that was the kind of thing for me. So when I did years later get into it by accident through the local radio station, it came as a bit of a surprise. But I decided to just go with it. And here I am. It all worked out. That thing that I really didn't want to do is the thing that I ended up doing.
You're saying there your first interest in politics was the Iraq War. Do you think that really fueled an interest and a passion into it, or was there sort of other things, background, family influence?
Well, Iraq was a big thing for me. I mean, I did have a family, like my mum in particular was very interested in politics, and I think I probably get a lot of that from her. But Iraq was quite pivotal, I think, for people my age. I'm 35, so I was 17 when the second war in Iraq happened. The first Gulf War actually broke out on my 5th birthday in 1991, and I still remember it vividly because I got the day off work. Don't worry, I wasn't working at
child labour.
I got the day off school because it was my birthday, and I remember watching TV on my day off school, and it was the news, and it was the bombs, and it was the war. And on my 6th birthday, I remember asking my mum when the war was starting because I just got it into my head that the war was like an annual thing, and it just happened to occur on my birthday. So I was waiting for the war to start, and I didn't understand why we weren't getting all the pictures on TV. So Iraq, for some reason, always was a thing that stuck with me. And like I say, I was like, and this was before the second invasion. When I was a kid at school, I used to talk about Iraq a lot. You didn't have the internet then, but I used to, any piece of information about Iraq that was, would happen to come up on the news or would be in the paper, I was always very fixated on that. And I used to get quite upset about the situation there. So, and I think a lot of people my age maybe didn't have quite such a longer term experience with the situation there, but certainly the second Gulf War, it was really important in forming their view of politics and of the world. And I know a lot of people my age in the industry as well as in activist politics maybe, who really became politicised by that moment. Iraq and Afghanistan, which we'll probably talk about today, and generally the war on terror, 9/11, and how that really influenced the future for that generation. So there's a lot of stuff, I suppose, that in the background to it, but it's always difficult to know why you become interested in something or why you become interested in the field of work that you're in. But certainly in my upbringing, there was a lot of thinking about politics, a lot of awareness of things that were going on outside of our bubble.
You mentioned Afghanistan there. Obviously, if you turn on any news channel at the moment, it's the pictures being broadcast are on constantly. We'll probably feel another generation a bit younger than me and Patrick into politics. What was your take being in Afghanistan and what you've watched? David Pratt, obviously, weeks ago had warned and he could foresee that this situation was happening. We saw America and Joe Biden take a very, backward step, if you will, looks as if he won't extend the deadline. Britain and France look as if they want to extend the deadline. It just makes the past 20 plus years look like a waste of time, really.
Well, I mean, if you rewind 20 years, we had the shock of 9/11 was quite profound in the West. There's no doubt about it. And when the invasion of Afghanistan happened a short time later, I think there was probably a kind of naive hope among some people, even people who would have been critics of that action, but still a naive hope that if this was a global effort to respond to such a massive, just a huge event, then maybe some good somewhere might come out of it. That was the hope. But I think lots of people felt at that time that that wasn't how it was going to go, that this was more of a knee-jerk reaction to a huge event. This was America wanting to respond in kind and show its might and flex its muscles. But of course, America was fighting a terrorist group. It wasn't fighting a country. So you can't really use the traditional warfare of fighting a country to fight something that is a different kind of entity. There was no plan really for what was the aim, what was going to be achieved by going into Afghanistan ultimately, and how long was it going to take? How was it going to happen? All of those kinds of questions, all that strategic stuff, that wasn't there. So it was a case of hope for the best, I think. And any of the smart political commentators of that day were saying that the best is not what's going to happen here, and warning that without a clear plan, this was all going to go terribly wrong. And what we've seen in the war on terror is Afghanistan, where we've been there for 20 years and made absolutely not a jot of a difference, really. The Taliban were able to go in quite easily and retake control. They basically just waited for the occupation forces to leave. So there's nothing in the last 20 years of that occupation has made any real change, I don't think, to the fabric of Afghanistan. Not enough of a change for it to hold, because it fell apart that quickly. In Iraq, obviously, we had the invasion. We then, we've seen what happened with Islamic State. It's been catastrophic in the region. Really, all the Western intervention of the war on terror post 9/11. I don't think in history we're going to look back at any of it and think that A, it did any good, or B, was worth it in any way. I think it's a massive failure. It's a huge embarrassment for the West. And I think because we are in the West, we probably don't have an awareness of that properly. I think we're somewhat shielded because the West obviously doesn't want to accept or admit that level of defeat. But I think globally, the way that other countries are looking at us right now, the mighty West is not as mighty as it once was. In the last 20 years, I think have really shown that. It's a really, really huge moment in history. But in terms of what happens right now, the kind of current thing and what's happening in Afghanistan, I don't think we're going to see a huge response from the West over and above what we're seeing. The West knew that coming out of Afghanistan was going to lead to this. It's maybe happened a little bit more quickly, but I think they know defeat. And this is what we're seeing, it's defeat.
We've now withdrawn and we're apparently going to take in 20,000 Afghan refugees. Unfortunately, that decision lies with Priti Patel, who must be one of the most evil politicians of the last 30 years. I think we all agree that probably 20,000 isn't enough. How many would you like to see? How many do you think we can take? What percentage of the responsibility of the mess that we've left there do we have to shoulder by taking in refugees?
Well, I've got quite a radical view on this. I think given the mess that we've created in that region, anyone that wants to come here as a refugee should be allowed to come here as a refugee. As many people as want to should be allowed to come here and have security, have a roof put over their head, and not have a bad word said to them about it, because that is our responsibility. We want to talk about this big humanitarian West that went to Afghanistan and went to Iraq to give them democracy because we care that much. If we care that much, we'll take the refugees, because that would be the truly humanitarian thing to do right now. What's the chances that that's going to happen? Quite minimal. We'll do the very, very bare minimum. And even at that, people will complain about it. And the refugees that come here will be made to feel unwelcome by large parts of the population. So I think that the behaviour of the West, there's a lot of PR about the humanitarianism and all of that stuff. But when push comes to shove, when it comes to real action, that's where we see the true colours, and they're not good.
We'll get on to the welcome immigrants probably get and refugees get whenever they come to the UK and other parts of the West, especially when refugees come. But to touch on the mighty West, everybody and a lot of political commentators, Angela, said last year when Joe Biden was elected as US president that America was back. It was back on a global scale. Looking forward 3 years just now with this whole scenario, to many US voters, America probably looks quite weak to their usual self. Do you think this could possibly hand back the White House to Donald Trump if he wants to run again in 2024?
Possibly. It could be Donald Trump. It could be something worse than Donald Trump eventually. I mean, I think America's gone through a lot of domestic crisis because of the Trump era, and just that I think there's been some soul searching forced upon America, and there's quite a lot more to do. One of the interesting things about the Trump era was that a lot of his most hardcore supporters were very much anti intervention. They didn't think America should have the role in international politics that it had. It didn't. A lot of those people didn't believe in occupying other countries. They thought that America should leave others to get on with what they're doing and focus on America. A very nationalist, very narrow view of take care of ourselves and screw everyone else, I think is where they're coming from. And I remember that you could even see on social media, there was, I think when it was Trump's first intervention in Syria, there was fury among some of his hardcore supporters because they really didn't feel like, I'm sorry, Francis, come here, darling. They really didn't feel like that was not what they expected from Trump, basically. So I think it's ironic that it's taken Biden actually to pull the troops out of Afghanistan in the end rather than Trump. But I'm not sure that it's going to be, excuse me a minute, Francis, come here, darling, come here.
It's the mention of Trump. Other people react like that, I think.
He keeps putting his dummy in this container and then getting annoyed with it. Right, stop getting in there, darling. So, yeah, it's ironic that it's Biden that's ended up actually pulling the troops out of Afghanistan and not Trump. But what that would indicate to me is that there's maybe not as much appetite in America and among some countries in the West for that interventionist kind of strategy. I think that there's plenty of people that can see the evidence that this has not worked. This has not been the positive global influence that they may have once thought it could be. And if that's the case, then really what is the point? Because you're sending people, you're sending troops, young men and women abroad, many of whom will die or experience injury or have serious psychological problems as a result of what they've seen. So I think there's less appetite for that kind of stuff in the West than there may have been once. But it's difficult to know. I think that there needs to be a bit of an evaluation done to really get a handle on how people within the West really view and evaluate the last 20 years and how it may have changed the way that we see our sort of place globally in the world, and also how we are seen by other countries, how it may have diminished our status, because I certainly don't think it's enhanced it.
We were talking earlier about refugees, and you were saying how they shouldn't have a word spoken to them about if they were to come here, they shouldn't be discriminated against at all, and I totally agree with that, because we've messed up their country. They should be entitled to come over and live in ours. About 4 or 5 weeks ago, a Japanese man called Kyogo Furuhashi moved to Scotland. He's not a refugee, he's probably quite a wealthy individual, but nonetheless he was racially abused on a bus. Well, people were making racist remarks about him on a bus on Sunday morning, travelling up to a football game. What do you think? You know, I think every adult human knows that racism is wrong. No one is born a racist, so it has to be learned behaviour. How do you think why do you think we keep on seeing incidents like this happen on a sort of semi-annual basis, on a semi-regular basis, and what is the solution to it, if there is one?
Racism is not, just because we know racism is wrong, it doesn't mean that it solves it, because there are a lot of people in the world who don't care about being wrong, who don't care about the fact that their behaviour can harm other people. They simply don't care. And as long as we have that, we're always going to have problems like racism, homophobia, misogyny, you name it. They're always going to be there. The problem I think we have in Scotland in particular with this is the willful ignorance of so many examples of it, as I think what then empowers those people to go on and be quite bold and quite public about it, to be brazen enough to do it on a bus in broad daylight and be filmed and have that put on the internet. And as Celtic supporters, as people, you know, as many Celtic supporters come from kind of Irish Catholic heritage, we know more than anybody what that experience is like in Scotland, because we've faced discrimination for decades, you know, and while our lives might be better, us three sitting here, I'm sure that the stories that we heard from our parents and our grandparents were, you know, could be pretty horrifying. And the problem is that it's not recognised, it's not acknowledged. The truth is that this idea of sectarianism, as we call it in Scotland, it implies that there are two football teams, one's a Catholic team, one's a Protestant team, and they both hate each other because they are both equally intolerant. And that is not true. That is so far from the truth. The truth is that Celtic is a club founded by Irish refugees who were not welcome because they were Irish refugees. It's the same kind of racism that we might see towards Syrian refugees today, or towards Afghani refugees if and when they come here. That's the root cause of it. It's not about two equal sides with a mutual hatred of each other. And that point, that very simple fundamental point, has not been properly acknowledged. We're still using this language of sectarianism. And it doesn't, you can't tackle a thing if you can't even call it what it is, if you're trying to pretend it's something else. And that to me is a problem. When you have something like that, then I think it emboldens the racists, the people that have treated us in such a horrible, discriminatory, sometimes violent way in the past. It makes them think they can get away with it, basically. And so what happened to Kyogo, that doesn't surprise me. And the thing that annoys me about it is you often see like politicians and people on social media suddenly, you know, fainting with shock. Isn't this terrible that this could happen in Scotland? We are so much more enlightened than that. And I'm thinking, really? Seriously? Because you can go to certain football grounds all throughout the year in Scotland and you can hear a lot of songs being sung about Fenians and how they should go home. So I don't think we're as enlightened as you think we are. So it doesn't surprise me, and it annoys me when people fake this surprise and shock and horror and claim that we're better than that and action's going to be taken and that sort of thing isn't welcome here, because it happens here every week. It happens here every day. And until we get a true acknowledgement of that, it's not going to change. And when people like Kyogo come from other countries, they're going to be just as subject to it as the Irish Catholic community in Scotland continue to be.
On that point, Angela, next month, I think it's 34 planned matches through Glasgow in one day. Through Glasgow City Centre, it was something we touched on with Kevin McKenna last week. You're talking about that difference that people seem to want to do between sectarianism and racism. But for a lot of Irish Catholics in Scotland, the planned matches next month to them are, you know, racially aggravated against them. And if it was anti-Semitic matches or anything else, it would not be allowed. So I think the point you're saying there on, you know, the shock horror that politicians use at these points is like, okay, but it happens on our own doorsteps. You know, as you say, every day, every week here, probably all been experienced to it. How, for you, does that change? Because, you know, many times people will say, if we go back to the changing of council in Glasgow, for instance, that Labour council's now out, got a new council in SNP, but it's just been the same. So how far do we change that? Because there's been different campaigns. There's been a flawed legislation went through Parliament over 10 years ago that has been repealed. How does things change?
Well, the Call It Out campaign, of which I'm on the committee at Call It Out, has been vital, I think, to really starting to make some changes with what's going on. But Call It Out is quite clear on how we see it. We do believe in freedom of speech and freedom of expression and the freedom to march. And that includes for people that hate us. I mean, the SDL, for example, the Scottish Defence League, or the Scottish version of the English Defence League, whether we like it or not, they do have a right to gather, and sometimes they gather, and it's, most of the time it goes without much happening, really, because the gatherings are so small in Scotland. But we do have to recognise that sometimes when we don't like it, people do still have a right to these kinds of expressions. But what Call It Out said was that where the line is when those marches are going past Catholic churches, because they are deliberately going past Catholic churches in order to intimidate Catholics, to make them feel inferior. There's a purpose to that. There's a reason why they go past them. There's a reason why these marches go past Catholic churches, stop outside them, and bang their drums as loud as possible. Now, you tell me that's not intimidation. Tell me that's just freedom of expression. That's just cultural creativity. Of course it isn't. So Call It Out said enough is enough. A few years ago, outside St. Alphonsus, an orange walk was going past as Mass was coming out. And the priest there, Canon Tom White, was attacked at this Orange March. Now, someone was later convicted for that, but I think that was a turning point where we just said, this is not, we've lived like this for too long, it has to change. So Call It Out was born really effectively as a result of a culmination of things that had been happening, and Call It Out has been fighting ever since to have some changes made, and quite successfully. We have seen these anti-Catholic marches being rerouted away from Catholic churches, because we would argue that it's a balance of rights. Yes, they have the right to go out on the streets and march and do what they like, but we have a right to be protected as well. We have a right to be free from intimidation and to be able to go about practicing our faith without fear of violence or fear of hatred and intimidation. So we've been making great progress. However, I would still say that, well, I acknowledge and recognise and support the right to assembly and to these freedoms. And I think it's very dangerous when you start taking them away. So I'm always very reluctant to go down that road. However, I do think if there was, 34, 35 marches in a single day of, say, the SDL, and they were all going. Now, I don't know how many of these marches are due to go past Catholic churches this time. It might be some, it might be none. I don't know. I haven't looked at the routes. But let's just say hypothetically, 35 SDL marches were planned, and they were all going to go past mosques in Glasgow or synagogues. I think everyone would have a problem with that. I think people would say, no, that's too much. Even if they weren't going past mosques or going past synagogues, the fact that they were anti-Muslim or anti-Jewish and there was going to be 34 or 35 of them in a single day, I think people would recognise that is a form of intimidation. It's like mass intimidation. So I still think that politicians need to be looking at this and asking the question, are we protecting the targeted minority here? Are we getting the balance of rights right? Because it doesn't seem to me like that's what's going on. So I think there's going to be some controversy ahead as these questions, or these uncomfortable questions, have to be asked. And as a community, we are in a much better position, I think, than we've ever been, thanks to the help of Call It Out, to be able to demand answers.
You were saying that you're on the committee for Call It Out there. I think I'm right in saying it was about April 2019, those two relatively large walks, planning to walk by, it might have even been St. Alphonsus Church, but certainly Catholic churches in Glasgow. And I think they lodged an objection with the council. The council said that they had to reroute, and then they just cancelled them altogether. So is it as simple as lodging a complaint with the council? They then change it, and then eventually these things fall apart. Is it really that simple to get them stopped? Or
well, there was now you have to forgive me on the detail of exactly how this went down, because since 2019 I've had a baby and a global pandemic happened, so I might have lost my grasp of some of that since then. But the council did make some decisions to reroute. That was then challenged in court by I'm going to say the Orange Order. It was challenged by some group representative of that culture, even if it wasn't specifically the Orange Order, it was something like that. They challenged it in court, and basically the court found in favour of the council. So that was great news for us at Call It Out, because it's expensive to go to court and do all these things, and we don't really have the money to be taking things to court. So actually it was the other side, if you like, that took it to court, and they lost. And that was massive for us, because that meant, well, here's a judgment, here's something that we can hold up and say, well, no, when it comes to assessing these rights, these enshrined rights to do with freedoms and expression and marching and minorities and all that, we can hold that up and say, do you know what, we are on the right side here, our argument holds. So I think it's going to be a lot harder in the future for the Orange Order to hold any marches that are going past Catholic churches, and certainly with Call It Out, they're going to meet a resistance to that. I wouldn't imagine that Call It Out is going to allow any of these marches to happen without us having a presence outside Catholic churches as a form of protest to say that this isn't acceptable. And that is a really powerful statement, because we never used to do that. Historically in Glasgow, Catholics kept their head down. They stayed out of the way when these marches were going on, because they are intimidating, they're frightening, and you would be at risk of experiencing violence. So Catholics didn't do, the idea of going and standing outside a church and protest, it would have been crazy at one point. Things have changed now. So we're now seeing a challenge to this culture that we've never seen in Scotland. And I think the next few years are going to be really interesting on that front.
Even I think a couple of months ago, when we saw some terrible images coming from George Square, I think the language used by politicians after that was even a step forward in the right direction, that they started to use anti-Catholic rather than just the usual sectarianism line that they usually use. So I would say
that was a massive difference, and that didn't go unnoticed at Call It Out, because language is important here when I'm talking about acknowledging things for what they are. And the fact that the word sectarianism has been used for so long, language really matters. So we've been always really clear that we're not talking about Orange Order marches, we're talking about anti-Catholic marches. We're talking about anti-Irish racism. That's what these things are. So finally, to hear politicians using terms like that when they haven't done it before, that's massive, because it means that they are finally, through the work of campaigners, they are finally being able to recognise what this is, and then feeling empowered enough to talk about it in that manner and with that language. So that, it seems like such a little thing, but actually, I really hope that people in our community realise how big a deal that was. That says a lot about the progress that's been made, and it gives me a lot of hope for the future.
Yeah, I think it was a positive step forward, especially seeing, the Defence Cabinet Secretary saying that, using that language, as well as the First Minister. So it probably was a big, massive step, and I'm sure a positive one, that people are starting to, really take this seriously. I've probably seen a clip on Twitter that went about last night. I think probably majority of folk tuning in might have heard it. Hugh Keevins in Clyde One last night said that 60 years ago, racism is worse now than it was 60 years ago. What would your response to that be?
I haven't heard this. So what did Hugh Keevins say, that racism now is worse than it was 60 years ago?
Yes.
In the context of Celtic and Rangers, I think was what he meant. But what he said was, it's worse now than what it was 60 years ago. But I think he meant in context of the football. But that's what he said. Well,
I'm only 35, so I can't. I'm a young thing like you two. I don't remember what it was like 60 years ago. I think arguably, things have got a bit worse. It depends what you mean by worse. We need to stop thinking about things in that frame of sectarianism for a start. But I think that like the rise of the independence movement in Scotland, so some political things that have been happening that are completely out with football or anything like that. But I think that there's been a rise of various things. We've had the rise of the independence movement, which then challenges that kind of British nationalist view that exists in Scotland. We've had, even in the last couple of years, the creation of the Call It Out campaign, which is directly challenging anti-Catholicism and anti-Irish racism in a way that hasn't ever happened. And I think that what you find is that when groups of racists, or people who are used to getting away with this kind of stuff, who are used to other like minority groups feeling inferior and knowing their place and running and hiding in fear, basically, when they go out on the streets to intimidate them, when those groups of people are suddenly being challenged, and challenged by people who refuse to shut up and go away, and who know their rights and who know how the law works and who are being quite clever about how they're approaching this, you're going to get a backlash to that. I think that's inevitable. Now, the problem is that people then, they blame the minorities sometimes for that. You're standing up for yourself, so actually you're the provocateur. You're the one that's making this worse, because if you weren't challenging it, you wouldn't be making these people so angry, and they wouldn't then be going out into the streets in their thousands and shouting racist slogans. That's a really warped view of it, but that is actually what some people think. So I think we're going to have this ahead of us for a few years, where and this is what the sectarianism thing does. It tries to equate two sides with each other, and so I think that people are sometimes going to try and paint the Irish Catholic minority as the troublemakers of the piece, purely for challenging that kind of racism and for standing up for their rights. And I think that for people like Hugh Keevans, or for any reporters, and whether it be in football or politics or inequalities or anything else, it is really vital. It's a huge responsibility for people in their position in the media to stop using the sectarian framework, because what that actually does is it needs to make us part of the problem in order for that sectarianism thing to have meaning. And that's dangerous. That's really, really dangerous, because we are a minority, and we're a very targeted minority, a disproportionately targeted minority, and the hate crime statistics back that up when it comes to religious hate crime. So I think it's time for some of those people in positions, whether it be on the radio, on print, on the TV or whatever, to recognise the responsibility there, to call this out properly, to call things for what they are, and make sure that their criticism is directed at the actual racists and not the people who are standing up for their rights.
We've seen over, I think it was Thursday, it came out, the cooperation agreement between the Scottish Government and the Green Party. Do you think that this is a positive step? Do you think it's a step closer towards independence? And what are some of the pros and cons, in your view, of the Greens and the SNP working together in a sort of official capacity?
I don't think it doesn't ring any scary alarm bells for me in the first instance. I've seen some some pretty strong reactions to it that I think are maybe a little bit overblown, and it's ironic because we've been told that that the SNP winning a majority in the Scottish Parliament, or just very short of a majority, which we've seen, but still, being in power. The Scottish Parliament was created with a voting system that was supposed to avoid that kind of thing happening. It was supposed to be a rainbow parliament, proportional representation, so that you would have much more equal representation across the different parties. So the SNP's been criticised. I don't know why the SNP's been criticised for this, because it's the voters' fault, really, for voting for them. But the SNP has faced some criticism for having that amount of power. So now that they're going into a more formal power sharing agreement kind of deal with the Greens, you would think that that people would be welcoming that on the basis of it being bad for the SNP to have too much power. So it's almost one of those, they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. And I think the reaction is maybe a little bit dramatic from some quarters, but that's probably for a reason as well. A lot of that dramatic reaction is going to come from unionist quarters, and let's face it, a coalition or a power sharing or whatever you want to call it of two pro-independence parties in the Scottish Parliament is not what they want to see. So is it going to create any huge massive change? I don't know. I'm not sure how much these kinds of arrangements really do that. At the end of the day, it's still all politics. It's like a tug of war, trying to get certain policies through and having to make concessions on other things. So is it going to be some sort of groundbreaking, radical political era? No, I would be amazed if it was. But I do think it's interesting. Someone thinks I'm talking too much. That's my son trying to put his dummy in my mouth. I think that's me told. So no, I don't think it's going to be a big radical thing, but the optics of having two pro-independence parties in power in Scotland, that is quite important. I think that's perhaps the most important part of it.
I think in the last bit, a kind of a formal cooperation deal, Patrick, tell me if I'm wrong, it was 2007 that a deal was made, and I think the Greens benefited out of that in two policies. We've already seen free public transport come in for under 21s too. It's happening next year, so there's probably a positive to doing that. But to look at COP26 obviously coming to Glasgow this year, Angela, we know how fragile the world is at this point in terms of the climate emergency that we're in. Scotland probably one of the first countries in the world to have Greens in power in government. Do you think that's a positive step that maybe some other countries, I know that the Greens are doing okay, holding up still in the polls in Germany, that we might need to see a shift in political change as we, become even closer to the climate emergency?
I think we need bigger changes. I mean, it's not a bad thing to have to see that support for Green parties is increasing enough among the public that they're then finding themselves in position to have kind of power sharing agreements in government. But how long has that taken? That's what worries me. It's the time scale, because politics can, in some ways, in a very short term way, it can feel like it moves really fast. But in the long term, when it comes to bigger things happening, it moves very slowly. We're on, election cycles of 4 or 5 years in democratic countries, and most parties that are in government are more concerned with what they do within 5 years to get elected for the next 5 years. They're not going to be making big plans for 15, 20 years down the line. And that's really what we need in the climate change fight. We need a broader vision. And I don't think it's served well by that structure. So it's difficult. I just think that the issues that we have with the climate, I'm not as convinced that they can be solved within the current political and economic landscapes that we're in. Our democratic structures and our sort of capitalist economics at the moment, I don't think that they accommodate the scale of change that's required to fight climate change. I think we need bigger change. I think we need economic change. I think it's time for us to move on to a new system of economics entirely, a new way of doing things. And the kind of the technological revolutions that we've seen, they kind of underline that argument, because the old ways of capitalism don't necessarily always work in the same way with the internet and the online connected world. So maybe it is time that we start to think radically about a brand new way of doing things, of structuring things. I just don't, I feel quite pessimistic about the political or the sort of public appetite for that. I don't want to sound like a massive pessimist here about the climate, but I feel like the scale that we're talking about here is pretty unprecedented.
I think UK terms as well, Angela, like, the Tories just now are still holding up in the polls. It's more than likely that they will be re-elected to government again. So, who would trust a Tory to take you through a climate emergency and sort out the problems, as you say?
Well, we saw what they did with the pandemic. So, a lot of their friends in business made a lot of money out of that, but a hell of a lot of people died. It's and that's the scary thing. The thing that worries me is how much public support they still have, despite what we've seen in the pandemic. So, I think we need something really, really quite radical to change in terms of the climate. And I don't know what that is. I don't know what that looks like yet. But it's going to come to a head.
Well, when you say we might need a new economic system, do you think that's a sort of socialist system, a social democratic system? Do you think, is that how we transition in terms of transport, energy, the way we retrofit our houses, or, the way we eat or diet, everyone becoming vegan? Do you think it's social democracy, socialism, or is it some other economic system that we haven't quite found yet that is the solution to all this?
I think it's going to need to be something new. And I appreciate that people on the left, I think some of the values of left-wing ideologies are certainly good, and you would want to take into a new system. But I think too many people in the left are still very, very rooted in the old left, and trying to recreate that to some extent. You can't recreate that now. We live in a different world. It's just completely different. You have to get away from that. I think we need really new creative thinking. And my theory actually is just that see the kids that have grown up with the internet and growing up with screens, the 2-year-olds that can pick up an iPad and know what to do with it. They're the ones that are probably going to come up with it, because they're the ones that are going to have, their brains will have been wired from birth to understand the world in a different way than I can. And I think that they're probably going to be the ones that can have that vision that we need, which is why it's so important, particularly after the last year and the pandemic, that we nurture the youth. And as much as I can be a pessimist, I can also be a huge optimist. And actually, I think that the pandemic for a lot of young people will have been a massive challenge to their resilience, to the way that they see the world, to their values, to so much about their own being. And I think that if you can combine what they will have learned at a very, very young age about life because of the pandemic, we combine that with the drive that young people seem to have for tackling the climate change crisis and creating a better way of living, I think that the optimism, the hope is going to be in the young people. So the old codgers like me, it's, I think, my job to be stepping aside as much as possible and trying to bring those voices through, and also make sure they're not trying to dive bomb off the couch.
we just hope time doesn't run out for them, because I think that's everybody's fear, that generation does get the chance, as you say, because I think there's a lot there to be said. It's something I've not properly thought about, as you're saying there, the challenges that younger people have faced. Obviously, they'll have lost a lot of their education, but what have they learned at home, and what different values have they learned at home? In terms of independence going forward, we've touched on an SNP and Green Formal Cooperation deal. The nationalist side at this point in time, if that deal does go through and we see Green MSPs in government, looks very united, compared to a unionist side that looks very divided, that can't even agree on how to run the UK or Scotland. If another independence referendum does happen, which I think it's probably more than likely, whether it will be in this term of Parliament or not, again, I think that's going to dictate the future of Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP. How do you see it going at this point in time? Would it be better for the Tories and unionists to do it sooner rather than later? Is it a case that it's just going to build and become too much?
I mean, I think that the Tories probably, or David Cameron probably thought that around Brexit, because you remember that the Brexit referendum happened a lot more quickly IndieRef did from the time when it was announced, like, here's the date, we're going to have a campaigning period. It was only like weeks between that and the Brexit vote happening, whereas in Scotland it was like 2 years. And I think the idea was that if we do it really, really fast, it's not really going to give any of the campaigns enough time to get off the ground properly and change anyone's mind. And at that point, the polls were indicating that people would vote to stay in Europe. So I think they took that risk and lost spectacularly, because actually, you found that the kind of Nigel Farages and the far right find it quite easy to mobilise in short spaces of time when they're talking absolute nonsense, because it's quite easy to have an effect when you're talking absolute nonsense. You can say whatever the hell you like. You can quite easily change people's minds with that, rather than with facts and accuracy and well-researched stuff. So that would be a huge risk, and you would think that the Tories have possibly learned that post David Cameron, that you can't just take for granted that a very quick call your bluff vote would work, because if it doesn't work, that's a huge gamble to take. That's a massive gamble. We saw that with Brexit. So excuse me for having a child on my head. But how it's going to go, I don't know. We've had the unprecedented thing of the pandemic. There's no denying that it doesn't matter what anyone's political objectives or whatever their political schedule or timeline was before. It's not going to be that now. The pandemic has changed everything. And I think actually even the public probably feel exhausted, particularly in the UK, from Brexit having happened right before this as well. And I don't know that it's always a great idea to hold huge political votes like that when people are tired, when people have had so much change already happen to them, that they just want some quiet time to not have to worry about anything for 5 minutes. I think a lot of people feel like that right now. So I think the SNP is probably going to want to wait this out a bit. The trouble that they face is that they do have elements within the indie camp that are very restless and think that the SNP are taking far too long, and would go even further and think that the SNP are actually quite managerial now, that they're just interested in staying in government and don't really want the radical change of independence. I don't think that's true. I think the SNP exists for independence. Nicola Sturgeon's been a member of the SNP since she was 16, or her whole life has been about the independence project. I don't buy that she has suddenly just got a bit comfortable in the seat of power and no longer has that interest. I don't think that's correct. And I think that under Nicola Sturgeon, we have seen that the opinion polls and things have been all going in the correct direction. So the pessimism in the indie camp, I think when you look at things from a bigger picture perspective, I don't always understand it. I think sometimes maybe it's just a little bit of competition for power. Some people think they can do a better job than Nicola Sturgeon, basically, and they want to have that power and recognition within the movement. But I would still say that the way things are moving, I feel like it is going in the right direction, and we have to still... We're not through COVID yet. Restrictions have lifted a lot, but we're certainly not through it. No, I don't think anybody feels like we've had the end of the pandemic. I'm not even sure what that would look like, but I don't think anyone thinks we've had it yet. So I think that big things like independence, and I mean, if the Brexit vote had been due to happen in the middle of COVID, I don't think it would have happened. I think it would have been postponed, and I don't think anyone would have had a problem with that. Indie's the same kind of deal for me. I think that we have to let this period reach some kind of a conclusion before we can then start thinking about more massive changes. But I'm still quite optimistic as someone who's pro-independence. I do feel I very much believe that Celtic
Celtic can win the league and Scotland can be an independent country. That's all we wanted to hear.
What a week that would be.
Yeah, I do definitely believe that Scotland can and will be an independent country. I believe that this little boy will one day be living in an independent Scotland.
You were saying there that the SNP have quite a few restless supporters, that maybe people are speculating that they're a bit too managerial and they might not believe in independence all too much anymore. That was the sort of feeling we got from Kevin McKenna when he was on last week, that they might be a bit slow and they're not as determined as what they used to be. You've also seen a sort of split in the camp where you've now got a section who are supporting the Scottish Green Party, where climate is definitely their main concern. You know, they don't talk about independence as much as the SNP. It's not their raison d'etre. And then you've obviously got the Alapa Party. They sort of sprung up in March. And I think there was a portrayal in the media that the independence field is pretty split. And there's, you know, it's fracturing and there's divisions appearing. But when we had John Curtis on the podcast, he was saying how you've actually got three major unionist parties who have three very different visions for the United Kingdom. And to make that into one coherent argument for unionism is actually quite difficult. So do you think it is as splintered as what some people online, maybe on their sort of Wings Over Scotland blogs might say, or do you think it's actually pretty unified in comparison to the unionist camp?
I don't think that the splits in the independence movement are anything like as dramatic as they're portrayed. I mean, look at Alaba. You know, Alaba got more coverage than a brand new political party on the outset of an election would ever normally get, because Alex Salmond obviously was the founder and leader. But political parties of that size don't normally get that level of coverage, and it did absolutely nothing for them. I think that they thought that Alaba was going to come in, and on the basis of there being splits within the independence movement, that they would hoover up a lot of votes. The fact that they didn't would indicate to me that the splits, the so-called splits, the independence movement aren't quite as bad as is often made out. I think that some of the issues that people think are really pivotal in the independence movement, I'm not sure that they are. We see a lot about the trans debate online. I'm not going to get into the whole, you know, why this is a big thing, because that would be a whole other podcast. But the point is that whenever polls are done more nationally, you know, more about, you know, asking the public more generally about how they feel about these issues, what their opinions are, you tend to find that there is not half as much aggravation in the general population as there is on social media. Now, Scottish Twitter is a very small bubble. Scottish political Twitter is a tiny bubble. But a lot of journalists in Scotland spend a lot of time on it. And I think it means that we come away with this inflated sort of sense of what matters to people. But when you go out into the real world and ask them about all those issues that everyone's talking about on social media, they just look at you like you've got two heads. And they'd be like, sorry, do you know that there's a pandemic happening? I mean, I really don't care about who's falling out with who over some debate on Twitter. I mean, so I think that there's a very real danger in the media in Scotland of really misreading what it is that people care about, because they're relying far too much on social media. And social media is a place where people fight. People are rewarded for fighting on social media. It's how the algorithms work. So if there is any kind of split within the independence movement in terms of even just a split of opinion, it's going to be amplified, way over amplified, into, you know, you could be looking at it thinking, wow, this is huge. Like, they're all really, you know, claws out, falling out with one another, blah, blah, blah. That's not my experience of the independent movement offline at all. And actually, I think sometimes it suits unionist commentators to try and imply that there's a bigger problem than there actually is. And that goes a lot towards the responsibility that we see sometimes in the media when it comes to reporting on big issues, just because it's more favourable for one side.
You spoke about, Angela, at the start of the podcast before you went into journalism. You had a lack of faith in the industry. You said there that you know, there's a very small Scottish political Twitter bubble that everybody seems to be involved in. As someone wanting to go into journalism in my last year of uni, what's your thoughts and your outlook on, you know, Scottish journalism, Scottish political journalism at the moment?
Don't do it. Get another job.
Say that.
Actually, I think Scottish political journalism is one of the best places to be right now, because it's so exciting. I mean, if you think like at the peak of my career, we had the Scottish independence and referendum. Then we had the EU referendum. Like we have had unprecedented. Like the amount of elections that I've covered is ridiculous. You know, we were having snap elections. We had Holyrood elections, council elections, European elections, referendums. It was ridiculous. I mean, it probably one of the busiest periods that we'll ever have in political journalism in Scotland, without a doubt. And it was so exciting because you had national media attention as well. You know, you had the big international broadcasters and media outlets, publications coming to Scotland because they were fascinated by what was going on here. And we weren't used to that kind of attention. So it was a really interesting thing to observe and to be part of. And that hasn't finished yet. That there's going to be more to come. Post-pandemic, the question of Scottish independence is still to be settled. And the aftermath of Brexit is still to be evaluated, and how that changes Britain's position in the world. So this is a historic period that we're going through in British politics. Is incredible. We are talking about potentially the UK may all stay together. This may just be a sort of a blip, and we all do a bit of soul searching and decide that the union's the better thing to do after all. That might be what happens. On the contrary, we might find that we have an independent Scotland and a reunited Ireland at some point in the coming decades. So this period that we're in is potentially really that historic. It's that big a moment. And for anyone who's interested in political journalism, go into it with that in mind. Think about the bigger picture. Don't think about the sort of more tedious domestic. And I don't want to downplay it, because domestic politics is important. Things that are happening in people's life is important, but there is a bigger thing going on here, and you have to put everything into that context. And if you can do that, then I think you'll really, really enjoy it. What I would say though is don't rely on print to make a living, because unfortunately the print industry in Scotland has just been absolutely decimated. Think more about broadcasts, think more about online, digital, think about doing things differently, and think about being innovative in the way that you're telling stories.
Just finally from me, Angela, before we wrap up, you're saying we're definitely not out of COVID, and that's why we shouldn't be focusing on independence just quite yet. Where do you think we are in the pandemic? How have you felt over the past 18 months? How are you feeling now? And what do you think an endpoint looks like? Is it just 95% vaccine uptake? Is it, we sort of move on from this after the winter months? And secondly, have you got a score prediction for Sunday?
Well,
it's the first time you've ever done that.
I'll take the second one first, because that's a really easy answer. I don't do score predictions. That's one of my superstitions. Every supporter's got their supporter superstition. Mine is score predictions. Every time I do them, we lose. So believe me, you don't want me to do a score prediction. But with COVID, I don't know if you managed to catch it, but Nicola Sturgeon did a COVID briefing today. Numbers are rising quite worryingly. The test positivity rate, I think, is around 12%. The WHO says that it should be below 5%. If a country is in control of the pandemic, then that test positivity rate will be below 5%. So that would indicate that we're somewhat losing control. But I guess that would be expected with schools going back and with lockdown restrictions easing. We knew that there was going to be a rise in cases. So I don't think that everybody has to panic straight away when we see that happen, because otherwise we're going to be panicking a lot, because that is just an inevitable consequence of coming out of lockdown. What's most important for me is how that's translating into hospitalisations and deaths. Those are the most important figures. I think that we will probably never, I'd be surprised if we ever get to a situation where some people don't die from COVID, but that's much in the same way as every year people do die from flu. It's unfortunately a consequence of some viruses, that if certain people in the population who are for whatever reason more susceptible to them, and that can be older people, sometimes it can be children though. There are some viruses that children are that harm children more than they do adults. So this is across the population. Viruses do different things to different people, and people probably use the comparison with flu a little bit too often. But the truth is that people die from flu every year. not a completely insignificant number, and yet we don't think we didn't traditionally think of that as being something that we would be fearful of in our daily lives. So I think that eventually that's what COVID will get to be like. The best scenario for me is that we have the vaccines, that we get some longer term data on their effectiveness so that we understand, do we have to keep getting boosters every year? How is that going to work? Or do we get a much longer term effect from them? But importantly, I'd quite like to see the development of treatments for COVID continue to improve, so that if you do end up hospitalised with COVID, they can do a hell of a lot more for you in hospital than they've been able to. Because one of the problems at the start of the pandemic was that I think that doctors were just a bit flummoxed as to how to treat it effectively. The things that they were trying, the drugs they were trying, the techniques, they just weren't. This was a new virus and it just wasn't doing anything. We've seen some improvements there, but I think that could be a vital thing in the future, is if they can find more drugs that can deal directly with COVID, so that for those who do get it, it can be a much, much less serious illness. The end of the pandemic, though, I suppose in the heaviest of lockdowns, I had these dreams that the end of the pandemic would be like, someone rings a bell and says, that's it, it's over. And we all spill out onto the streets and the news starts to play and we all sing and dance and kiss and hug, and it would be wonderful. That's what I wanted the end of the pandemic to be. But it's not going to be like that. I think it's just going to be a gradual, grudging return to normality. And it's not probably going to be this huge celebratory thing that we thought, because with the end of the restrictions comes the end of the furlough scheme, comes the end of the relative safety and security that people were able to get from the government. That's all going to stop. So we're going to see unemployment start to rise. We're going to start to see those very real economic consequences, I think, impacting people. So it's going to be some really challenging times to come yet.
Yeah, it's still an evolving situation. Me and Patrick will be on here week in, week out to talk about it along the way. But Angela, thanks again for joining us today.
Yes,
really
thank
appreciate you giving up your time, and
thanks for
having
us.
Yeah, us. That's it. Yep, and we'll let you get out and enjoy a bit of the sun with the wee man. But thanks again for coming on, and thanks to everybody for tuning in to watch another episode of the